Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I speak in strong support of our Conservative motion calling on this government to remove the outrageous and, frankly, unconstitutional liberal values test. A liberal values test that requires that individuals or organizations who apply under the Canada Summer Jobs Program sign an attestation that they subscribe and support the principles and values of the Liberal Party of Canada as a prerequisite to funding. Now, the members opposite can sugarcoat and downplay and misrepresent the values test that they have imposed, but make no mistake about it, Mr. Speaker, in substance, that is precisely what this government is calling upon individuals and organizations to do.
Exactly.
This liberal values test is wrong. It's discriminatory. It's mean-spirited. It violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Hear, hear.
And what it means is that churches and faith-based groups right across Canada are going to be denied funding under the Canada Summer Jobs Program. Churches and faith-based groups who have relied upon the Canada Summer Jobs Program to do the many good works that they do in communities across Canada. And these groups, churches, and organizations have hired students to do things like help refugees and feed the hungry and provide summer camps to kids. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, thousands of students across Canada have gained valuable and practical experience. And I would submit, Mr. Speaker, it's in many cases more than just practical hands-on experience, because when we're talking about working with refugees or assisting and helping feed the hungry or working with kids in a summer camp, that type of work for a young person, a student, can be meaningful, it can be impactful, it can be life-changing and life-lasting. But now, Mr. Speaker, that is at risk thanks to this government's bigoted summer attestation liberal values test. Mr. Speaker, as a result, churches and faith-based groups are faced with a choice. They can sell out their principles and values by signing the attestation, or they can forfeit funding, Mr. Speaker. And this is not something that is abstract. This is not something that is academic. This is something that is real, and this is something that is taking place right across Canada. You know, the honourable members opposite keep talking about the fact that there really is no problem here. There really is no problem. Just sign the attestation. I mean, who could disagree with the attestation? Well, Mr. Speaker, I have a church in my riding that signed the attestation. And they sent a letter along with their application in which they checked off the attestation, indicating that they objected to the attestation, that they believed it contravened the charter rights that apply to them, including freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of belief, Mr. Speaker. And you know what happened to their application, Mr. Speaker? It was rejected. It was sent back to them. So much, Mr. Speaker, for the words of those honourable members when they say there's no problem here.
Right.
Because here's an example of a church that signed the attestation that had their application rejected. And you know what, Mr. Speaker, they were attempting to hire students for? And by the way, they've hired students for many, many years, and they've had no problem until this liberal values test. They were hiring students, and I'm reading from their application, to assist persons with disabilities, to assist newcomers to Canada, to assist Indigenous peoples, to assist visible minorities, and to work with children and youth. And thanks to this Liberal government's values test, their application was rejected, Mr. Speaker. I have another organization in my riding that has just given up. They have said they cannot, in good conscience, sign on to a values test that talks about a core mandate. Because it's not just saying, I accept the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. No, that's not what the attestation says. It says a lot more than that. It talks about a core mandate, and it goes on, Mr. Speaker, and they said, it's not our core mandate. We can't sign off on that, in all honesty. We have more integrity than that. We don't agree with it. It's not our values, Mr. Speaker. How many other organizations are like that? And you know what they run, Mr. Speaker? They run a summer day camp for vulnerable youth. And they're going to try, Mr. Speaker, despite this government's intolerant values test, bigoted values test, I would say, to nonetheless try to move ahead with the summer camp, but they just don't know whether the summer camp for vulnerable youth will be there this summer. I say, Mr. Speaker, that's a real shame, but it's thanks to this government.
It's a reality.
You know, the Prime Minister likes to talk a good game in his usual self-righteous self. He speaks about diversity, inclusivity, and tolerance. But, Mr. Speaker, actions speak louder than words. And the actions of this government time and again show that their actions are different than the words that they speak of when they speak of diversity, tolerance, and inclusivity. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Henningly talks about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Mr. Speaker, through this Canada Summer Jobs Liberal values test, this government has demonstrated that they have no regard for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This is a government that has no regard for fundamental freedoms, Section 2 rights under the Charter, freedom of religion, conscience, and expression that are not just any freedoms, but fundamental freedoms, Mr. Speaker. The Liberal values test, Mr. Speaker, is antithetical to inclusivity, diversity, and tolerance. It is antithetical to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is antithetical to Canadian values. And, Mr. Speaker, if this government meant what it said and did what it said, it would do the right thing and withdraw this bigoted, intolerant, unconstitutional, and quite frankly, Orwellian Liberal values test. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is really distressing to hear the honourable member across the way continue to confuse and inflame the situation by the constant reference to values. In the attestation, the word used is mandate. And in conversations I've had with churches in our riding, I made it very clear. If we look at your mission statement, your vision statement, if there's nothing in there that says you are deliberately in business to work against certain rights and freedoms that women and the LGBTQ2 community enjoy, you should have no problem in ticking off the attestation, because that's not the business you're in. I've also had comments with a Baptist minister And I said, you know, the chance of abortion rights or gay rights coming up at a soccer camp or a cooking class are zero. Will that member start to take responsibility for using the word values incorrectly when it's not mentioned in the attestation? And will he take responsibility for the fact that a lot of churches will not go ahead and run their summer camp programs because of the way he has deliberately misinterpreted what the attestation said?
Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, it does say values, and it also speaks about a core mandate, and it goes beyond stating that one organization adheres to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so what the honourable member is saying is simply false. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, based upon the experience of the church in my riding, it apparently isn't even good enough to sign the attestation, because in the case of that church, it was rejected out of hand on the basis that they simply expressed opposition to having to sign the attestation for a program that would have provided services to Indigenous peoples, to disabled Canadians, to refugees and children. And Mr. Speaker, it's a real shame.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for St. Catharines.
Mr. Speaker. We hear Conservative Speaker after Conservative Speaker mention liberal values test. And, Mr. Speaker, that seems like code. They don't want to come out and say pro-choice. They don't want the Canadian public to find out. So they're trying to embed this code, liberal values test, which is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is shameful. I was wondering if the honourable member, who is a lawyer, could stand up, knowing full well that nothing in this attestation limits anyone's access to freedom of religion or freedom of speech. Knowing that, how can he stand up in this House and suggest that this violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms?
Well, member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Mr. Speaker, I have no hesitation in talking about what this attestation says. That includes a core mandate respecting reproductive rights, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in a free and democratic society, there can be no religious or values tests, Mr. Speaker, and that is precisely what this government is trying to impose upon churches and faith-based organizations. The honourable member knows full well that many churches and faith-based organizations cannot, in good conscience, sign on to that, because at the end of the day, that is not part of their core mandate.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Dauphin, Swan River, Neepawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The other two parties in this House always claim that they are progressive. I'm reminded of what the great free market economist Friedrich Hayek said. Inside every progressive is a totalitarian screaming to get out. And this is why I'm so proud to be a conservative. Our caucus, there are people with multiple views. I happen to be pro-choice. Others happen to be pro-life. We have members that work with the LGBT community. And not once have I, as a conservative MP, ever been coerced or told to change my beliefs. My beliefs and the beliefs of my friends and colleagues are accepted and cherished by all of us, regardless of what those beliefs are. I'd like to ask my good friend, what is it about the Conservative Party that makes us so different from the totalitarians on the other side?
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for Dauphin, Swan River, Neepawa, and unlike those on the other side, we welcome Canadians to freely express their views. We value the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We respect fundamental freedoms of freedom of religion and conscience and expression, Mr. Speaker. That's something that the honourable members opposite seem to have a problem with. And I have to say, how did we even get here? How did we even get to this point? Because there was no problem with this program, no problem, until this government decided to drive a wedge to divide Canadians, Mr. Speaker. It's politics at its worst.